If you're not still there, I'd like to invite you to turn back, if you will, to Ruth chapter 1. And we're going to spend just a few moments together just gleaning a few things from this great book. Benjamin, did you see what I did there? You're gleaning. There's a lot of gleaning going on in this book, and so we'll see if we can do some gleaning together this morning. Ruth. B. Rice saw what I did there. He appreciated that. One of the great characters of the Bible, and a woman that we can learn so much from. We can learn about dedication, devotion, submission, humility, being a shining light in a dark place. So much that we can learn from just a 4-chapter book set in the historical backdrop of the period of the Judges. But in order to kind of appreciate who this is and where we are as far as biblical history is concerned, let's take just a moment and set the historical scene that I'm sure most of you are very aware of. When you get to the end of the book of Judges, you read in verse 25 of chapter 21, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes." And that's really a perfect way of summarizing this period in human history, particularly as it relates to the Jewish nation. When you get to the beginning of the book of Judges, in Judges chapter 1, you have the final accounts of the conquest of the land of Canaan. Then when you get to Judges chapter 2, we read about Joshua's death and the generation that was a part of Joshua's life and relationship with the nation of Israel. And it says very tragically, as I know you remember, in Judges chapter 2 and verse 10, "When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, that generation of Joshua and those of his age, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel." Now, this period, as far as human history is concerned, is around the 1300s BC to around the 1000s BC. And so of a period of several hundred years, you have the nation of Israel going through this perpetual, repetitive cycle where they would rebel against the Lord would deliver them into the hands of an oppressing neighboring country. They would spend a few years in that oppressive state. They would finally come to their senses. Their eyes would turn upward. They would repent of their sins. God would send them a deliverer, a judge, and then they would live faithfully as long as that judge was alive. And then as soon as that judge died, they would go right back. In fact, Judges chapter 2, if you continue to read on in that passage, they would go back oftentimes into a worse state of sin and wickedness than the state that they were in when they got delivered the last time into the hands of one of their neighboring nations. And so you have Israel that's part of this cycle. And this is what we have when we are introduced to, first, a woman by the name of Naomi, her husband Elimelech, and her sons Mahlon and Chilion. We find out in Ruth chapter 1 that they live in Bethlehem, but a very specific Bethlehem. A Bethlehem that Micah refers to in Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, "Blessed are you, Bethlehem Ephrathah." I know I did not pronounce that right. I can never pronounce that one right. But there were a couple of Bethlehems in Judea. This was the one that would produce the Messiah, the prophesied one, which makes Micah's prophecy in Micah 5:2 so powerful, such a powerful messianic prophecy, because it wasn't just Bethlehem. It was the specific one that would produce. Well, why was it chosen? Well, we're seeing some of the background as far as why that particular Bethlehem was chosen. It's because of who was born there, and who was born there is directly related to who we're introduced to in this book. And so we're introduced to this woman, Naomi, her husband Elimelech, her sons Mahlon and Chilion. There's a famine in the land. It's interesting, Bethlehem, if you've studied the meaning of that name, I think according to the Hebrew, the meaning of the name Bethlehem is house of bread. And so in a town named the House of Bread, apparently there's not much bread to go around. And so Elimelech and his family make the decision to go into the land of Moab. What do we know about Moab? Do we know any characters in the Bible that were Moabites? Well, first of all, who are the Moabites? I think we're introduced to who became the patriarchs of those great nations in an extremely tragic story found in Genesis chapter 19, where you have Lot's daughters in a lapse of faith, engaging in an incestuous relationship with their father after getting him intoxicated. They both conceive, they both give birth to sons, Moab and Ammon. Those two sons, their descendants, become these two groups of people, the Moabites and the Ammonites, who were regularly and consistently thorns in the side of the nation of Israel. Though they were related by blood, Lot, of course, being the cousin of Abraham, Jews, descendants of Abraham, Ammonites, Moabites, descendants of Lot. I think I said cousin, it's nephew, right? I'll get the family tree correct here in a moment. But you've got this continuing ill will that exists between the Moabites and the nation of Israel. On one such occasion, we're introduced to the king of Moab, a man by the name of Balak, in Numbers chapter 21 and 22. And you remember Balak hired that notorious character Balaam to try to employ him so that he would curse the nation of Israel. When you get towards the end of the book of Numbers, you're getting near the end of the 40 years that the nation of Israel spent wandering in the wilderness. And now they're getting near the end of that 40 years, and they're starting to move closer to the Jordan River to cross it and then inhabit and possess the promised land, the land that God was ready to give to them 40 years previously. And so they're getting closer and closer to that area. The Moabites, as far as where they lived, for the most part, it was on the east side of the Dead Sea, southeast corner of that region as well. So in Numbers 21 and 22, the nation is moving. They've already engaged in a couple of skirmishes and been victorious in those when you get to those chapters in Numbers 21 and 22. And so they're moving, they're being victorious. God is preparing them to inhabit the land, and Balak sees them on the horizon coming his direction. He wants no part of them. Things have not gone well for others who have tried to get into their way. He does not know what they're up to, and he does not want them overtaking he and his people and their land. So he tries to employ Balaam to curse them so that bad things will happen to them. That's just one example of the kind of relationship throughout the course of the history between these two nations that existed. Isaiah, I believe in Isaiah chapter 15, prophesies against the Moabites because of the assistance they provided to Nebuchadnezzar when he came in to invade Judah and carry them off into captivity. God did not need the Moabites helping Nebuchadnezzar. He was plenty strong enough to do it himself. God had employed Nebuchadnezzar. It was through God's will that he allowed Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians into Judah. This was a prophesied judgment on the nation, and it was their job. It wasn't the job of anybody else. But the Moabites, because they hated, the Edomites did it as well, because they hated Judah so much, they said, hey, can we help y'all loot and pillage and capture and just, anything you need us to do to help you do away with these Jews, we're here for you. And so that's the kind of relationship that Moab historically had with Judah. But apparently at this point in time in history, maybe there was a little bit of period of peace here that existed where this family, Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons, felt that it was safer for them to go down and dwell in Moab than it was to try to survive and exist during the famine that was in the land there in Bethlehem. And so they leave Bethlehem with the intent of finding better circumstances in Moab. Now that you know this book well and you know what happens to this woman and her family, Naomi, while in Moab for a period of around 10 years, loses her husband. We don't know under what circumstances. Her sons both die in this foreign pagan land. Well, she's heard now that there's bread back in the city of bread, Bethlehem, her home, and she makes the decision to return there. But she says to her daughters-in-law, the ones that were married to her sons before their death, she says to them, Ruth and Orpah, you stay here. There's no need for you to go with me. There's I'm barely going to be able to take care of myself, and I'm not going to be able to help you and assist you, and so you'll be better off among your people, marrying someone among your people, and starting a family with your next husband. Naomi, of course, as you know, is dealing with incredible bitterness in her heart because of the circumstances that she has endured in the land of Moab. Look with me again at one of the passages that Aaron read for us just a moment ago, there in verse 13 of Ruth chapter 1. Naomi says, "The Lord has gone out against me." Look what she says in verse 20. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Look what she says in verse 21 about the time that she spent in Moab. "I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty." And then look with me at what she says at the end of verse 21. "Why do you call me Naomi?" That name meant pleasant, "since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me." So what does she say? The Lord has gone out against me. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full. The Lord has brought me home empty. And the Almighty has been against me, testified against me, and has afflicted me. You don't get more down. You don't get more discouraged. You don't get more depressed. You don't get more bitter than Naomi was when we read about her here in Ruth chapter 1. In fact, so much so that she says to these two daughters-in-law, "Stay here in your home." And it's interesting what she says, "Stay here with your gods." She spent 10 years in the land of Moab. She has, I'm sure, been exposed to and is acutely familiar with the gods of Moab. Moab was no different than any other of the nations around Israel. They were pagans. They were idolaters. The primary idol for Moab was Chemosh. It is said in history that human sacrifice was very common to this pagan god. Very vile spiritual rituals that they engaged in as a show of worship to this pagan god. One of the more notorious pagan gods as far as this point in history and this region is concerned. And Naomi is so despondent. She's so bitter. She knows in her heart of hearts that she's going back to a land that is supposed to be, though it fails often, supposed to be devoted to the one true and living God. And Naomi is acknowledging the one true and living God often, but she's acknowledging him as being the cause and the reason for all of her problems. And she's basically laying everything that has happened to her at the feet of her God. And so it may be that she's thinking to herself, well, he is the true and living God, but look at how he's dealt with me, and they may be better off serving their false idol. That's how despondent this woman is. That rather than help these women remove themselves from this pagan land, being surrounded by people who are devoted to this pagan god, and taking them back to where they may at least have an opportunity to be exposed to the true and living God, she is so depressed, despondent, and bitter. And she's at such a low point in her relationship with the Lord that even though they've both said, "We're willing to go with you back to your homeland," stay here. And in essence, marry one of these pagan men and stay here in the presence of your pagan God. That's how low Naomi is. But one of the things we learn from this great book is that even though Naomi had given up on the Lord had not given up on her. And the Lord, in his patience and in his long-suffering and in his mercy, allowed her to lash out, allowed her to blame him, allowed her to change her name. Don't call me Naomi. That name means pleasant. I am not pleasant. Do not associate that name with me. Call me, is it Mara? Because that name means bitter. And that name is representative of who I am on the inside. And so here she is willing to turn her back, give up on her relationship with the God of Israel. But the God of Israel isn't ready to turn his back on and give up on her. So we need to remind ourselves when we have those times where we feel, where is the Lord? When we feel those times of great distance, when we feel those times of great separation, when we feel those times of great doubt, we may be about ready to give up on the Lord is not ready to give up on us. And if we can just weather that storm and hold on to our hope, hold on to our faith, and maybe we stumble, and maybe we fall, and maybe we stay on the ground a while before we finally work ourselves back up again, but the Lord is going to be there waiting on us to get back on track. And He's got things in store for us maybe beyond our comprehension. And so Naomi, bitter in heart, bitter in soul. In fact, when you read the book of Ruth, there have been some in commenting on this book. In fact, I heard one preacher say on one occasion, if I had the option to name the book, I would have called it the book of Naomi, because Naomi is referred to by name or reference to a third more times than Ruth is in this book. And not just do we see Ruth and the things that we can learn from her, but we can learn a lot from Naomi too as well. We can learn how low we are capable of getting when life dishes out for us what we perceive as a horrible hand. But we can see the redemption that we're capable of if we never completely lose faith and lose heart. And so you've got this beautiful story of loss, of bitterness, of pain, of suffering. And you get to the end of the book and you've got restoration, renewal, hope, and a future. You see this beautiful journey that Naomi undertakes in this great book. We're introduced in this book to a man named Boaz. You remember who Boaz's mother is? It's Rahab. Isn't it interesting that you meet this man, and one of the first things that you read about him saying is as he's walking through this field that he owns, he says to the gleaners, "Blessed are you in the Lord." So he goes around with the Lord on his lips and the Lord in his heart. You see his integrity, you see his justness, you see his righteousness, and yet he's a first generation, second generation citizen of the nation of Israel. Adopted in, if you will. His mom, Rahab, a citizen of Jericho, of the Canaanites. And here's Boaz, her son. Look at the character. Look at the devotion. Look at the integrity that this man has. And you think about the circumstances that his family was in just one generation ago. But you look at how the family tree of Rahab was altered based on her faith, her acknowledgement, and her humility. Rahab was able to completely change her family tree. Sometimes if you ever listen to Dave Ramsey, he's a financial advisor that has a radio show, and he talks to people sometimes, and he says, maybe you were born into a family where your parents made horrible financial decisions, and maybe their parents made horrible financial decisions, and you've been born into financial difficulties. He says based on the decisions that you make, based on the choices that you make, the wisdom that you use in handling your money, he said you can change your family tree. It may be that you were part of generations of generational poverty. And yet he says you can, starting now, based on the choices you make decisions that you can provide for yourself, and you can provide blessings and literally change your family tree going forward. Well, far more importantly than that is making a spiritual decision. And so you see examples like this in Scripture of someone who came, as far as spiritual conditions are concerned, a very impoverished situation. And Rahab was in a city where there was no one around her that was willing to submit to, acknowledge, and be willing to be a part of this nation and in worship to their God. And yet you have Rahab making that choice, she and her family being delivered, and now her son, Boaz, a resident of the city, that's going to eventually produce, because of he and his offspring, the promised one, the Son of God. We can make decisions, spiritual decisions that not only will impact us, that will not only ensure that the Lord has a place for us in heaven, but it can impact our family tree going forward, our children, our grandchildren, nieces, nephews, great-grandchildren can be impacted eternally based on the decisions that we make today. But one thing I want us to pause, and I know it's the passage that's very familiar to you. It's the last part of what Aaron read for us this morning, found in Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. I've never used or heard marriage vows that are more beautiful than this commitment that Ruth makes to her mother-in-law. If a bride and groom could stand in front of one another and just exchange these two verses, nothing else would have to be said. And so Ruth provides for us what clinging means. Let's look at this again. In verse 14, they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. It's the same word that's interpreted cling, or if you're reading from the New King James or another translation, it may read join to in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, when the Lord is giving us the principles and the instructions concerning the marital relationship, that a man and woman is to leave father and mother and cling, that a man is to leave father and mother and cling to his wife, be joined to. It literally means, according to the Hebrew, to be glued together, a permanent bonding. That is what God expects for the marriage relationship to be. That's the way it is designed. And here is Ruth, who is willing to make that kind of pledge and that kind of commitment to this woman that Ruth is probably thinking to herself, she doesn't have anything, I don't have anything, but we'll go back home and we'll not have anything together. And we'll at least have each other. And so Ruth is making this decision. I am going to cling to, I'm going to be joined to, I'm going to be glued to this woman. And everything that comes with that. Your people are going to be my people. Your God is going to be my God. And where you're buried, I plan on being buried in that same cemetery. And what does she say at the end in verse 17? Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. No bride and groom could make a more virtuous, loving, noble pledge or commitment to one another than Ruth makes. She teaches us what clinging means. She teaches us what being joined together, what being glued together means. She teaches us. This woman, a Moabite, whose family were probably worshipers of Chemosh, whose ancestors were lifelong enemies. They were the Hatfields and the Jews were the McCoys. I don't care. I'm a Moabite, you're a Jew. I'm telling you, I'm committed to you. And I'm willing to accept not just you, be joined to not just you. I'm willing to be joined to your people. I'm willing to be joined to your God. I'm willing to go where you go and die where you die. And I'm telling you right now, there's going to be nothing but death that's going to make me not keep this commitment. Naomi could say nothing else. And look at the way God was able to work through this kind of commitment, this kind of devotion, this kind of virtue. When Boaz found out about Ruth, saw her gleaning out in the field and asked some of his employees about her, and they said, well, this is the Moabite woman that came back with Naomi. Remember, Boaz is a near kinsman of Naomi. And you remember he makes provisions for her. I don't want her just doing the lawful thing, gleaning from the corners of the field that were reserved for the poor. I want her following right behind my gleaners, and I want them purposefully leaving things behind so that she can fill her sack. On one day, she was able to collect an ephah of grain. Weights and measures kind of vary based on what source you go to, but a conservative estimate is at least 10 pounds worth. That's going to feed 2 people for a while. It's interesting on the occasion when she went, and you remember she went into Boaz to basically propose marriage to him when he was sleeping after enjoying a very fruitful harvest, and he fell asleep, I think kind of leaning up against one of his harvest bales. And she goes in, lays on his feet, doesn't even let him know she's there. He wakes up that morning, he's startled. What in the world? Who's down there? And then before she leaves, he puts on her, I think it's 6 ephahs of grain. Okay, if what I went to find out the source of weight is concerned, that's 60 pounds of grain. Here you go, whack. I love you. Here's 60 pounds of grain to tote back to your house. Ruth apparently was pretty strong. I've seen my wife haul around a 50-pound bag of dog food, but she doesn't just haul it around, from where she bought it back home. That's amazing. But then, of course, you have Ruth. The reason why Boaz, the beginning of what he did for her, he says to her, because she says, I don't really understand why you're showing me this kind of favor. I don't understand why you're doing this for me. He said, I heard about what you did for Naomi back when y'all were in Moab. He said, your reputation precedes you. Your devotion, your dedication, your love, your commitment. You are a virtuous person, and you're now receiving blessings because of that. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7 says that whatsoever we sow, that we shall also reap. You see this biblical principle play out. When we give, it's given back to us, Luke 6 and verse 38. When we do, the Lord makes sure that we are provided for. Sometimes it's not in monetary means. Sometimes it's through peace. Sometimes it's through emotional well-being. And I don't know about you, but I'll take emotional well-being off a few extra dollars in the bank account any day. And so you've got Ruth being provided for because of who she was as a person. And the Lord was making sure she was blessed because of the devotion and the commitment that she had. We find out, of course, that Boaz marries Ruth. And they have a son by the name of Obed, who has a son by the name of Jesse, who has a son by the name of David. And the rest is history. And when you read in the genealogy, when it's traced Jesus' roots from Abraham to Joseph, you pause there around verse 3 and 4, and you read about Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, and you read about Obed, whose mother was Ruth. And then you have at the end this child. After she conceives, the Lord blesses her with conception. After marriage, they have this child. The child is presented to Naomi. The family line is extended. And it's interesting, you read on multiple occasions that the people in the community said, we hope that you were blessed, Naomi. We hope that this is a blessing for you. We hope that your name is made famous because of what you've been through. And you were empty. You were full, and then you were empty, and now you're full again. Little did they know what kind of name was being established by her family tree. Little do they know the level of fame that this family would achieve because of who would come from this line. Ruth and her devotion. A light in a pagan, dark land. And look at the blessings. Look at the way the Lord can work. Look at how far He can bring us when we feel as far away from Him as we ever have before. Maybe there's someone here this morning who you're maybe where Naomi was at the beginning of this great book. And maybe if you were to give yourself a name, you would give yourself a similar name. I'm bitter. I'm dejected. I'm despondent. I'm discouraged. Things have not gone the way that I thought they would. Life has been bitterly unfair to me. The Lord has dealt harmfully with me, talking the way that Naomi did in this account. Maybe you're feeling that way this morning. Maybe you're about ready to give up on the Lord, but please do not forget, the Lord's not ready to give up on you. We talked this morning during the auditorium class about that word restore. It's one of the most beautiful words in our vocabulary because we never use it, at least I've never heard it used in a negative context. Whenever we use the word restore or restoration, there's always something good that comes on the other end of that. It's taking something that was old and making it new again. And that's part of the process of repentance. That's part of the process of baptism. It's taking something that was old. It was taking something that has lost its luster, and it's making it brand new again. And that's what God offers to us. Through forgiveness, He offers us restoration. And you can be brand new again. If you've never become a child of God, you can this morning by repenting of your sins, confessing Jesus Christ as Lord, being baptized into Christ. For as many as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. Galatians 3:27. If you've done that, but you need encouragement, you need prayer.